Hi, my name is Dr. Lanier, and I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about the field of behavioral economics. So, behavioral economics is really the intersection of economics and psychology. So, as we know, economics is the study of how entities, that can be businesses or governments or individuals, how they make decisions regarding scarce resources. From a student's perspective, economics is typically studied by reading textbooks, listening to lectures, reading articles or newspapers. From a scholar's perspective, economics is studied by analyzing data that's been collected by organizations such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Federal Reserve Board or the CDC, for example. And scholars observe this data and then they use this data to develop a theory or develop a model to try to explain why economic events occur as they do. And then they will use that model and then try to project often what future occurrences might be and what future data might reflect. So the question comes to mind then, why and how do we intersect psychology with this discipline of economics? How do we bring, or why do we bring psychology into this economic conversation? And to explain the why behind that, I'd like to introduce or ask you to think with me about the concept of archery, the sport of archery. So let's assume that we, for example, want to be able to design a model that will enable us to hit the target every single time, that we want to be successful in hitting that target. So if we know the specifics of the bow, the size of the bow, the tension of the bow, if we know the characteristics of the arrow, how heavy it is, the point of the arrow, if we know how far it is from the archer to the arrow, and if we can quantify or describe and predict the skill of the archer, and we plug all of that knowledge into our model, then we should have success. We should be able to hit the bullseye every single time. Or maybe we don't. Sometimes we might think we have the perfect model and have measured all of these things with precision, and yet when we launch the arrow, we find that we miss the mark. Well, then the question becomes, how did we miss that mark? Are our misses random? Are they scattered evenly around this bullseye? If so, that might not be that big of a problem if the errors are small and they're random. In fact, in our economic models, we even have a term called the error term, which we use to account for those near misses. But what if the misses are not random? What if the arrow, instead of hitting the bullseye, what if it always goes up and to the right almost every single time? What if it's a predictable miss? Could it be because there was wind that we did not account for? Could it be that the arrow, the particular one we're using, has an unusual weight, that it's not balanced? Could it be that our bow is not calibrated? Or could it be that we have not adequately described or accounted for the skill of the archer, the training of the archer, or the habit that the archer might have? So there are two psychologists, Israeli psychologists, Daniel Kahneman, he's on the left, and Amos Tversky on the right, who, although psychologists, began looking at some economic models. And they began to challenge some of the theories that economists had developed in very specific areas, not all theories, certainly, but in specific areas around behavior of individuals, specifically the way that we tend to define or treat economic man. And they said essentially that they didn't buy it. They didn't believe that the economic theories were telling the full picture, and they didn't do a good job of adequately explaining how people would behave. Specifically, they said, you're missing the target. And not only are you missing the target, the misses are not random. In some certain scenarios, the misses are predictable. And if they're predictable, then we need to be able to try to figure out how to explain them. And so these men collaborated over a number of years, and they came up with a lot of different questions and scenarios where the economic predictions did not hold true in reality. And at first, these scenarios were just kind of hunches that they had. So they decided to get more academically rigorous around their pursuit. So they began to conduct some research, and the method of their research was very similar to a process that many of you have probably gone through in elementary school or middle school when you participated in a science project or a science fair. So they designed came up with a fundamental economic problem or question, and then they designed an experiment in which they could study that question. So the experiment could be involving a hypothetical scenario that they would present to someone in the form of a survey. They are sometimes done in labs where they'll bring people in to a lab environment and have them participate in a survey or a game, or sometimes they take the experiment out into the real world, into a setting in which people are acting in their normal everyday to day lives, and they are presented with the opportunity to engage in this research. But they designed the survey or a game, and then they recruit participants by one of the means that I just mentioned to you, and then they would conduct the experiment. And after they gathered their data, they would analyze the data, and then they would determine if the behaviors or if the responses were in alignment with what had been predicted. And if so, well, then that's fantastic. But if not, then the next step is to understand why not. And could these misses be predicted? Could they be interpreted? Could they be better explained? And more importantly, could the theories be refined so that we can gather a better understanding of how people truly do behave? So they essentially were the fathers of behavioral economics, Kahneman and Tversky. And in fact, Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for their work. Tversky passed away in 1996, and before the Nobel Prize was awarded for their work. But they created significant knowledge in our understanding of how individuals behave in economic situations, really due to factors that economists did not originally embrace or consider as important as they are. So some of the areas, and we've got a number of them listed on this slide, but one such area is decision fatigue. So I'm sure you've all been to a grocery store, and seen the candy at the checkout line. Well, that's by design. Marketers will think that after you've made all of these decisions with your shopping, you're weak and you're tired, and you don't necessarily make the best decisions after a series of decision making. It's why we see some individuals, high profile individuals, dress very similarly day after day, or while some people will always choose to eat the same meal for lunch every day, because it's one less decision that they have to make in a series of very important decisions throughout their day. Another example that we now better understand, thanks to the work of behavioral economists, is opportunity cost, and why more options are not always better, because sometimes people have a really hard time quantifying the cost of the options that they are choosing not to partake in. The next one I have here is something called the endowment effect. Research has shown that people, if they have an item, and let's say a pen, that by having this pen in my possession, I would want to charge more to sell this pen than I would have been willing to pay were I going to purchase it. And economic theory would say that those two prices should be in alignment, but studies show that that's not actually the case. And so now we understand more about why that's the scenario. This concept of confirmation bias argues that people tend to seek out information that continues to reinforce beliefs that they already hold. So knowledge of confirmation bias can help us understand why For example, in political scenarios, people become even more polarized rather than moving more towards the center. We understand now that people in general are much more confident than they really should be, given their skills and their talents, and we can begin to understand more of the ramifications of that. And we can also understand better why people might make one decision one day and another one the next. For example, you might have every intent of studying really hard for your final exams that are coming up. But then when it gets closer and closer to the day, that temptation to go to a party or go to a movie might overcome or surpass, you might be overcome by that temptation and not follow through with your intentions from the beginning. So the applications of behavioral economics are very wide and very broad and quite deep. They affect economic decisions, such as from an individual perspective, what we choose to purchase and when we choose to purchase. They impact scientific decisions and whether or not we believe the results of a particular study or a particular test. They certainly impact political leanings, and I've alluded to that already, the sources that we rely on for information. They've been shown to impact even legal decisions, like what time of day the court case is seen by the judge has been shown to matter. And all of this comes down to this better knowledge of psychology and how people make decisions in these scenarios. And then certainly, the behavioral economic tools, once learned, can impact and help us better understand our own habits and personal behaviors. I've had students in my class in the past who have no intent to continue to pursue a study of economics, or specifically a study in behavioral economics, but they've come back to me and said, you know what, my study habits have changed and my working out habits, and I now filter better what I read in the news because I understand more how individuals work and how more of the psychological features impact the economic decisions that I make. So that's a brief overview of the field of behavioral economics. I would be more than happy to answer questions that you might have. Just feel free to send me an email and we can chat.